Matthew chapter 11 verses 16 to 19 and 25 to 30. Jesus and John the Baptist. To what can I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to others. We played the pipe for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, he is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by her deeds. At that time, Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned, and revealed them to the little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light.
If you're a regular watcher of BBC Northwest Tonight, you may have seen a feature that they recently did 100 days since lockdown. And essentially what they sought to do was to tell the different stories that have emerged through this quite unprecedented period in our history. There were stories of incredible sadness as they recounted some of the people who've died through COVID-19, especially those who've been out there on the front line, so to speak. There were stories of immense courage and commitment as they highlighted the endeavours of other key workers. There were stories of hope as they told of people who've recovered, or looked at the work of people working in laboratories, making breakthroughs in finding a vaccine. There were stories of encouragement and goodness as they featured some of the acts of neighbourliness and how communities have really come together in recent days. And each of these stories in different ways will become the defining features of the season that we're now passing through. But many of those defining features will also be quite personal to us, or quite personal to the people who've been affected by them. And I guess that for many of us, one of those defining features, or some of those defining features, will end up being the things that we talk about that we never did. The invitations that we ended up never being able to accept, and the events that ended up never happening. And for some people, they will have been quite big events. You know, we've heard of weddings and anniversaries and significant birthdays that have had to be cancelled or postponed, or having to take place in significantly scaled down way from what was originally planned. And some big events too, like the Queen's birthday parade or the commemoration of VE Day, which had to happen in a very different way to the way that was originally envisaged. So this will be a time when we also remember the many things that we thought we were going to do that we ended up not doing, the many events that we thought were going to happen that ended up not happening, and the many invitations that were sent out that ended up not being accepted. Well, in our scripture reading from Matthew today, we also find ourselves confronted by an invitation. A very different kind of invitation, but a serious and a significant invitation nonetheless. And it is, of course, an invitation from Jesus. Come to me. Come to me, you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And these are some words of Jesus, as there are some words of Jesus that for various reasons stand out more than others. And these are the words that we often find ourselves repeating, words that sound particularly inviting in a world where we can often feel under immense pressure, a world that is often defined by deadlines and expectations and demands, and words like these are almost an oasis for us. Come to me and find release. Come to me and find rest and find peace. And for some of us, these are words that maybe have almost found fulfillment in recent days, because Again, and I say for some of us, this season of lockdown has released us from expectations and deadlines and pressures. Maybe we've even found ourselves asking why certain things have ever caused us so much pressure in the first place. Now that I've been forced to live without something, now that I've been forced to cope by not doing something or some responsibility or such like, why on earth did it cause me so much pressure in the first place? Why on earth did I ever feel such an obligation to do it? But that is only some of us. And I know that for others, not being able to do something, not being able to see someone, not being able to go somewhere has actually caused us immense anxiety and stress. And it seems to me that part and parcel of what it means to be human is that the same situation can affect people differently. So when two people are prevented from doing something, one can find this as a blessed release and a wonderful opportunity to reclaim that time for something else, while another person in exactly the same situation can be deeply troubled and concerned about things not happening as they should. And human nature being what it is, we then begin to compare ourselves to others. And the person who's okay about things begins to feel anxious because they feel that they should be a little bit more like the person who's more concerned. And then the person who's concerned becomes even more concerned because other people aren't concerned. And so that cycle of anxiety just becomes perpetuated. And if we think about it, our society very often works on the basis of anxiety. And those who recognise this and recognise this aspect of human nature can be very good at using it to their advantage. So, you see TV adverts that are seeking to make us anxious in case our whites aren't white enough, or raising the constant worry that we might have gum disease and all our teeth are going to drop out, or reminding us that our home is riddled with germs that need eliminating with the latest antibacterial spray. Why? Because if they can generate that anxiety, then we'll buy their products, which may be a little bit more expensive, but they can quell our anxiety, so it's worth the investment. And where did that anxiety come from? From the people selling the products, generating it through their adverts and their commercials. And our newscasters very often do exactly the same. Just look at how many evening news bulletins are presented, 9 times out of 10, with an opening introduction where we're hit in the first minute with a list of things that we need to be worried about. Why? So that we'll keep watching in the hope that our anxiety can be quelled. And how often, if we really listen, was that attention-grabbing headline really not quite what it was made out to be? It was a particular take on things, or it was telling us that something probably or possibly might happen but probably wouldn't, or this is an opinion of one person in the face of a crowd of others who've already recognised that concern but have already dealt with it. We live in a society that is fueled by anxiety. Anxiety is a key tool for marketing and communication, and it's into that society that Jesus speaks these words: "Come to me, you who are wearied and burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Now please hear me. I am not saying that everything that concerns us in life is simply the outcome of media hype. If there's one thing we've also learned from this current crisis, it's that we do need to take seriously the threat of a disease that has claimed the lives of over 500,000 people now around the world. It's not taught us that anxiety doesn't matter, but it's taught us that we need to be concerned about the right things. And many, many people have been seriously impacted by what's happened. And then, of course, some of us are anxious and weary because we do hold responsibility. We have genuine concerns for the well-being of others, and we've recognised how hard some people are working, carers and key workers, many of whom are not only having to cope with a surge in patients and cases, but also having to work in much more restrictive and demanding conditions with relentless cleaning routines and cumbersome and uncomfortable PPE equipment, and so I could go on. So yes, some of us are weary and heavy burdened with good cause. And the world in which Jesus lived was very different to our own in so many respects. But what I find interesting is that for all of that difference, he was confronted by very similar human experiences. He didn't just speak these words into a vacuum, or so that the gospel makers could make sure that they got written down and preserved for us to read in the stress of 21st century life. He saw those dynamics being lived out in front of him through the crowds that flocked to hear what he had to say. And what was it that made them weary and heavy laden? Well, it does us well to remember that the symbol by which this Jesus has always been remembered was the cross. And the cross, for those who engaged with Jesus at the time, was very much a sign of the times. It was a symbol of Roman oppression, a constant reminder that the Roman Empire, which had pretty much taken over the whole of Europe from our own island in the west right through to the Middle East and down into North Africa, would deal very severely with anyone who dared to challenge its power. And so it was able to impose systems of taxation that held people in poverty. It imposed control over the thousands of ordinary people in the lands that it occupied who weren't fortunate enough to be Roman citizens. People lived under constant fear and oppression. But the people were also no different to us. They also lived with social pressures to meet expectations and to conform. In the verses just before Jesus speaks the words that I've particularly focused on, we get this little glimpse into human nature which rings so true to our world today. Jesus has just been speaking about John the Baptist, who, for all his formidable presence in the gospel narrative, was facing his own struggles and dealing with his own doubts. And he sent his disciples to try and find out, to make sure that Jesus was the person that he described him as being. And as Jesus goes on to compare himself with John, he makes this interesting observation. John expressed his religious devotion through a quite extreme life of deprivation. He lived in the desert, he ate wild locusts and honey, and pretty much rejected most of the trappings and comforts of society. And people criticised him. Oh, he's possessed by a demon, he's weird, he's off his head, he can be dismissed. And then Jesus, of course, chose not to do those things. He did enjoy food and drink. He spent time with people that many others disapproved of. And then he just generated the complaint, well, he's not weird enough. He can't be religious. He's too normal. He's a drunkard and a glutton. Like I said, I'm not sure that human nature has changed that much. Two very different characters, but both, it seemed, were able to attract the criticism of those who wanted to criticise. And you could see in the words that Jesus precedes this with the origin of that idiom in our own English language about dancing to other people's tunes. We played the flute for you and you did not dance. We wailed and you did not mourn. In other words, Jesus is saying, you criticised me because I wouldn't dance to your tune. And Jesus won't dance to their tune. And Jesus says, take my yoke on you and learn from me. Don't fall into that burdensome trap of feeling that you've always got to dance to other people's tunes. But here's the thing. It's easy to see the timeless relevance of these words of Jesus. Come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden. We can see the attraction of a faith that liberates us from the expectations that others seek to impose, and that stands against the oppression of the principalities and powers that seek ascendancy. Of course, that's an attractive thing to see in faith. But as we look at the gospel narratives more widely, what we can recognise is that a great deal of the criticism that Jesus is referring to here actually came from religious people. If you're familiar with the Gospels, you'll know that they are laced with stories of healing and miracles and profound words that are spoken by Jesus and acts of incredible kindness and inclusion. But all of this happens against a backdrop of constant agitation and opposition from people who claim to serve the same God who we believe was embodied in Jesus. And in fact, if you carry on reading into the next chapter, they're at it again. Jesus happens to be walking through a grain field on the Sabbath, their religious holy day. And Jesus and his disciples do what we might do if we maybe saw a blackberry hanging in a hedgerow when we're out for a walk on a summer's day. They pick up a couple of the stalks of grain and they grind the flour in their hands and they eat it. And the religious elite are there with their rule books and their lists of expectations. You shouldn't be doing that. This equates to work and you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. They are so locked into their religious expectations. They don't even care about the farmer whose corn it might be. They don't say, hey, you shouldn't be nicking that guy's corn. Although, to be fair, the Old Testament law books actually did tell farmers to leave a bit of their crop in the field for those who were hungry. But you're breaking our religious rules. That was all they were concerned about. And can you see the irony of that? Jesus has just made this incredible declaration. Come to me, you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And within a few lines of the narrative, he's being criticised for not conforming to the religious elite's definition of the Sabbath. The day of rest, the day of shalom, the day of peace and release into the fullness of God's presence. They'd managed to turn what was supposed to be a day of rest into a day of regulation. So yeah, it's ironic, but like so much of irony, it's also tragic. At the heart of a society where people were oppressed and downtrodden, or as Jesus put it, burdened and heavy laden, they were offered a religion that just added further burdens and expectations on their shoulders. And for any of us who would be described as religious people, which I guess is likely to be the case if you're watching this, then it contains a massive challenge. It's a challenge to me, someone who's described as a church leader, whose life is defined by religious experience. The kind of faith that Jesus has in mind, the kind of relationship that Jesus is seeking to offer through these words, is not one that encumbers people with burdens and expectations. And we hear these words today, we hear them as those who will be burdened and heavy laden. I was reading a very insightful reflection a couple of weeks ago, which we've actually made available on our website, which is written by a Christian professional who works as a counsellor. And they were talking about how they work with people after sudden shocks and disasters, and comparing that with what people face as a result of ongoing stress and challenge. And they describe this as the difference between shock, which is sudden, and trauma, which is more ongoing. And the point that they were making is we might not always notice the cumulative impact of that ongoing struggle. And as I read that, I thought about some of the conversations that I've had in recent weeks with people who are frankly just worn down by a change of circumstances that haven't been a sudden shock or a single unmanageable event, but just a gradual wearying experience. And I guess that was also true of the people to whom Jesus was speaking. They'd lived under Roman occupation, many of them, for all of their lives. They'd coped with poverty. They'd been burdened by religious and social expectation from birth. They'd got used to it. But they perhaps therefore not noticed its impact on them. And the words of Jesus cut through that. The words of Jesus offered them something refreshingly different. The words of Jesus are an invitation to us to recognise the loads we're carrying and not neglect ourselves. So I want to suggest that this is one invitation that we can and we need to accept. And I would want to add to this that as a people of God, this is not just an invitation for us to accept, but also an invitation that in Jesus' name we need to be offering. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So this is an invitation that I would encourage us all to re-accept. The image of a yoke which very much came from Jesus' working life as a carpenter, is something that connects us. It was that piece of equipment that was put onto the shoulders of the oxen so that they could be harnessed together and used to pull the ploughs and the other agricultural instruments of the day. It didn't release the load from a beast of burden, but it harnessed it with others so that it could share the load. It harnessed it to the one who could steer them and connected their efforts to the agricultural tools that turned over the ground. Jesus invites us into that kind of relationship. A relationship of community, a relationship of purpose, a relationship of fruitfulness, a relationship of being led by the Spirit of God. And if there's religious stuff that you are finding unmanageable and difficult and draining, then maybe we need to ask ourselves if this is not light and easy. If this doesn't bind me with my sisters and brothers in Christ, if this doesn't connect me with Jesus and help me to fulfill the purposes of God's kingdom, then is this a yoke of Jesus making? Or is it just another religious burden of human invention? Let's remember that Jesus opens this statement with the words, "Come to me." Not come to church, not follow my instructions, not meet the expectations of religious elites. Come to me. Receive an invitation into relationship. And I hope, therefore, that this is not just an invitation that we can accept, but an invitation that we will want to give. It is Jesus that we are called to make the centre of our shared life. It is Jesus who commissions us to share the good news of his coming, the good news of his love, the good news of his salvation. We are called to be a people who offer hope and life and liberation to the oppressed, not judgment and expectation. These words of Jesus are sandwiched with religious judgment and expectation, and they are intended to stand out in contrast to that. So this is the invitation, and whatever other invitations we have had to decline, whatever opportunities we may have had to miss, whatever events we may have had to cancel or postpone, this is one invitation that we can accept. This is one invitation that we need to share. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.